What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of After the Buzzer. In this episode, we are going to be talking about something near and dear to my heart, the 2009-2010 New Jersey Nets debacle of the season.
I wanted to, particularly in person, get a chance for Chris to talk about this. If you recall in the last episode, we're diving into some pretty deep emotional things for Chris Brown here. And, the Nets in themselves, such an interesting, organization. It was particularly over the course of these last 2 decades we talked about. So I think Chris deserves a little time here to tell us about his time with the Nets.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think there are a lot of things you could say about the Nets over the last decade or so.
A lot of things.
Most of them probably not great. Things have been turning positively over the last couple of seasons, but when we think back to the 2009-2010 season, that was our senior year of high school. The Nets were coming off of probably their most successful era in Nets history. They had made it to the finals a couple of times, pretty deep playoff runs for most of that decade, and then everything kind of fell apart. And that was culminated in the 2009-10 season, where the team started out 0-18, the longest winning streak in NBA history to start a season.
0-18?
0-18. They ended up going 4-46 in their first 50 games. If you can imagine losing that many times. They had 2 coaching changes in season, and the best player on their roster, Brook Lopez, had nobody else around him. I mean, if I think back to that season, there were a lot of players who you would not think of as NBA players anymore. Guys like Trenton Hassel, Jian Lian, Courtney Lee, who's actually still in the league, I think.
Maybe on the Knicks. I don't know.
So there was not a whole lot going on, and that was punctuated by, as I mentioned earlier, the 0-18 start, 4-46, which is the worst 50-game stretch in NBA history to start a season anyway. Personally, I look back at that time as a fan in a few different ways. The first, obviously, being the misery that went along with trying to follow that team and root for them and have something to look forward to. The only thing we had potentially going for us was maybe getting the first pick in the NBA draft, which we didn't. We got the third pick, not even the second pick. So we missed out on John Wall, ended up drafting Derek Favors, who we traded later, a year or two later, for Darren Williams, and that didn't really work out either. The other aspect of it is I got to go to a lot of cheap NBA basketball games. There was not a lot of competition for tickets. I distinctly remember going to 3 or 4 games for $10 each, maybe.
Can't beat that.
And specifically, there was one game that I went to. Our high school, one of the guidance counselors or advisors, was planning a trip to a Nets versus Heat game. This was pre-LeBron, so just D-Wade. And going to the game, I remember I had my ticket in my backpack because my mom was telling me, you got to keep it in your backpack so you don't forget it. The problem was I went home after school, dropped my backpack off, and then left to go to the game.
It's a rookie mistake.
So I left early enough where I got to the stadium about an hour before the game started, and I lived a half hour from the arena. Pulled in, paid for parking, got out of my car, realized I didn't have my ticket. And now I'm thinking, oh my God, what am I supposed to do now, right? So I race home, get my ticket, go back to the stadium, and I made it to the game before tip-off. There was more traffic getting to the stadium the first time than approaching game time.
You must have been driving like Fast and Furious style.
Honestly, I was just going the speed limit on the highway.
Leisurely cruise back to try to make it in time.
You can't prove anything. So anyway, I think back to that moment as like, what a depressing moment for this franchise, where I could get to the game an hour early, leave and come back and park in almost exactly the same spot. It was pretty bad. It was pretty rough. I did have the fortune of seeing a win. They beat the Spurs somehow. I don't know how, but I was there. It happened.
It's because of you.
Yeah, I was one of hundreds of fans cheering the Nets on. And I think my favorite memory from that season is I went to the last ever Nets game at the Izod Center. And after the game was over, all of the seat back coverings were still on most of the empty seats. So I decided that I was going to take something back, similar to how you sneak a refill at a restaurant with a water cup. I thought, you know what? I deserve this. I have sat through this whole season, sat through this game where they fittingly lost. So I decided that this seat cover was going to be my keepsake.
FBI, if you're watching, I don't know the statute of limitations and something like that, but I mean, he's here. So,
seeing as the Izod Center is no longer used for anything, I think I'm in the clear.
What is that like to be a lifelong fan of a particular team? You know, I've bounced around 3 times to the chagrin of some of my friends. You know, to be in an arena, which is in itself such a magnitudinal feeling, to be in such a large place with people, and you've celebrated so many times. Maybe not celebrated, but you know, you've shared a lot of memories there. What's it like to be in a emptying out arena for the last time? That I just don't feel like that's something a lot of people will ever experience.
It didn't really feel that monumental at the time because, like I said, you know, the Nets went 12-70 that year. So I think most of the people who would have been there were already checked out. I think being there, it was a lot of emotions just from what you mentioned, you know, this sort of petering out of an era of basketball for a team that I had loved and still do. You know, fortunately, they still played in New Jersey for 2 more seasons after that at the Prudential Center, but the Izod Center, I mean, you joked about it, but there were a lot of happy memories there as a Nets fan. You know, I was at the Eastern Conference Finals Game 4 when they swept the Pistons and went off to go play at the Spurs in 2003. You know, a lot of good memories there to go with the bad, but I did want to point out that, you know, unfortunately that season was a low point, but something that I have something to remember it by, and, you know, now a couple of entertaining stories to look back and say like, hey, I was there when this happened.
I'm glad you brought it up, Chris. I hope to be at the Wells Fargo Center one day, probably sooner rather than later, when that is no longer and we've moved on to a new era in Sixers fandom and history. But I think that's so neat to have something like that, you know, from it's a place in time in history, and, you know, that's not something I think a lot of people got to experience.
Agreed. Well, thank you for tuning into After the Buzzer. If you have any other ideas or memories you want to share with us about your NBA fandom experiences, any keepsakes that you have from arenas you've been to,
yeah, what have you guys stolen?
let us know. Well, don't let us know if it's too recent. Make sure it's been a few years.